Well, don't. I'm just an adult. Yeah, just don't. With the kid. Good, because I need some of that.
Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Stephen Hegedus. I'm the Dean of the College of Education here at Southern Connecticut State University, and I welcome you all this evening to the 2022 Colloquium series, hosted by the newly established Center for Teaching and Learning. Thank you for joining us this evening to continue our series of important and timely talks this year on mental health as it relates to teaching and learning. This series is designed for our alumni and students who are working in schools, studying in college, and we also welcome faculty, superintendents, leaders in schools, and state and elected officials, though some are really busy tonight. As in all our colloquia, we aim to bring you speakers that are focused on relevant themes in education today, sometimes challenging and difficult topics, often with multiple perspectives and positions, but always in an open and respectful academic environment. So thank you for attending tonight and for your continued support. Following our talk tonight, please join us in the seminar room for food and refreshments. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Carrie Sassu, Founding Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning, who will welcome our speaker and moderate the session tonight. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate your kind introduction and your continued support of this series and the Center's events. I also want to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to all those who have assisted in making the events of this day a success. The events of a day like this take the coordinated efforts of many, and from students and faculty volunteering their time to organize and orchestrate events, staff setting up the rooms, making sure that technology works for us, and others associated with advertising the event and attending to many of the behind-the-scenes details that are oftentimes can be easily overlooked. So it takes a village, and I am grateful to our village for the partnership and dedication to this effort. The Center of Excellence for Teaching and Learning is about creating and fortifying bridges of connection. Connections that not only enhance our teaching and our learning through the formation of interdisciplinary projects, but also connections that extend Southern's outreach into the community and invite in partners with diverse perspectives that build and extend our current understandings of myriad issues. To all of you here tonight, our students, our staff, faculty, alumni, and friends of the university, I want to thank you for being present tonight. Your presence and your investment are valued, and I hope that you will continue to engage with the center in various ways for many years to come. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome and introduce our esteemed speaker, Dr. Frank Worrell. Before I do, I want to ask that if you have questions for Dr. Worrell, that you are aware that there will be time at the end for Q&A, but he has agreed that if you have a burning question that relates to clarification, he will entertain that in the process of his delivering his speech. Okay, so before I ask him to come up here, it is really my honor to provide you with some information about his background and to highlight just a few of his many accomplishments. In addition to being the president of the American Psychological Association, Dr. Frank Worrell is a professor in the Graduate School of Education at the University of California, Berkeley, where he serves as a faculty director of the School Psychology Program, the Academic Talent Development Program, and the California College Preparatory Academy. He is a certified school psychologist as well as a licensed psychologist. Born in Trinidad, Dr. Worrell originally intended to become an English teacher. Some of us heard about this earlier today. In his senior year of high school, he saw a student fall apart on stage at a school concert and decided to minor in psychology in order to help his future students. That was a good choice, by the way. But an introductory psychology course piqued his interest so much that he changed his major and never looked back, and clearly soared beyond that. He received his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Western Ontario and his doctorate from UC Berkeley. In addition to his position at UC Berkeley, Worrell is an affiliate professor in the social and personality area in the Department of Psychology. His areas of expertise include at-risk youth, cultural identities, scale development and validation, talent development and gifted education, teacher effectiveness, time perspective, and the translation of psychological research findings into school-based practice. Worrell has long been active in APA, serving as a member at large of the board of directors from 2016 to 2018. Dr. Worrell served as the president of APA's Division of School Psychology in 2007, and then on the APA Council of Representatives, representing that division from 2010 to 2015. He is a member of 6 APA divisions with fellow status in 5, and has served on multiple APA committees, boards, and task forces. He has authored more than 200 academic publications, and most recently co-edited the Cambridge Handbook of Applied School Psychology. His professional awards include the Distinguished Contributions to Research Award from APA's Division for the Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race, the Outstanding International Psychologist Award from APA's Division on International Psychology, the Nadine Lambert Outstanding School Psychologist Award, a Presidential Award from the National Association of School Psychologists, and a Presidential Citation from APA in 2011. I don't know when the man sleeps. So please, it is a great honor to have you here, but please join me in extending a warm Southern welcome to Dr. Frank.
Introductions like that always remind me of my age. Unlike my brother, I'm not graying as much, but I think I'm older than I look, just so you know. Thanks to Dr. Sassu and to Southern Connecticut State University for the kind invitation to be here. And I now need to say in a way that I never used to have to say before, the views expressed are not the views of the American Psychological Association, but are strictly my views, my own. And so these views may well be wrong and can certainly be disputed. Some lowering expectations, because I looked at the title that I gave, and I've been traveling every week since the last week in August. And I had to get a title to carry. And so I gave this title, and then I looked at it and said, I can't talk about that. That's way bigger than I can do. So I'll do my best, but just lowering expectations. I also want to acknowledge that the land on which Southern Connecticut State University is located lies in the traditional territory of the Quinnipiac, Golden State, Pacousett, and Wapinga peoples. We recognize and honor their stewardship of the land in the past, present, and going into the future. So here's what I'm hoping to do in the next hour or so, and take some questions. I'm going to sort of try to tell a story about what I think education is about, the situation pre-pandemic, and where we were, where we ended up post-pandemic, some immediate responses that we have made as we are getting into the tail end of this situation, and some cautionary tales. I'm going to talk briefly about evidence-based practices, and I know a lot of people came to hear about that, but in some sense, I think we know what to do already. We need to do the right things. And just because we're in a crisis doesn't mean that the right thing has changed. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the factors I study, just as ways to show that the kind of work that I've done, and these are factors that can potentially be used, right? So we are in that stage. And then some concluding remarks, and then hopefully take some questions. And so I'm going to begin with a question, and this is a question for the audience. I hope a couple of people answer it, or at least provide an answer. What is the purpose of schooling?
Yes. not only to educate the individual, but maybe provide them the experience of the social experience that comes with the education as well.
Okay, to educate the individual, but also to provide social experiences. Other thoughts? Yes.
Educated citizens.
Educated citizens. Okay, good plant. Yes. Cultural apprenticeship. I agree with all of those. So we used to think of education, right, the 3 R's, right, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And then, of course, they talked about, the rigor, relevance, and relationship, I think was the new 3 R's, right? But at the heart of it, right, so education is supposed to provide behavioral competence. So students learn how to perform. Social competence, somebody talked about socializing. And sort of emotional regulation. How do we learning to share, to work well together, and all of those kinds of things. And education is one and maybe the most important socializing mechanism in our society. And it's supposed to be a great equalizer, right? Because for many people, long before we had public schools, there were people who were being educated, right? Public education supposed to provide what the people of wealth were giving to their kids to our entire society. That's what, in fact, universal public education is supposed to be. And to my mind, it's supposed to open up possibilities for the future, right? I actually grew up, I was born into a household, my parents did not go to college. There was one tap in our household, the one in the kitchen. There was an outhouse. Our shower was outside and was open at the top. When it was raining, you didn't have to turn on the tap, and stuff. And so I am sort of not a likely candidate to be standing here today as president of the American Psychological Association, as a professor at the University of California at Berkeley. But I had wonderful educational opportunities which opened up possibilities to me in a way and stuff. So one can think, so to continue on this theme, this idea, as we heard from the back, preparing children and youth to be competent adults and productive citizens, right? Both of those. But we're not always as successful about doing that, right? So Tom Cale and Melissa Bray, the late Tom Cale and Melissa Bray, who's at the University of Connecticut, wrote in a book in 2011, an obvious but rarely discussed observation is that children are not appreciably better educated nor better behaved than they were 50 years ago. And what that says to me is that our education system is actually not living up to its goals, right? And today, we are not just educating individuals for our country, we are educating citizens for the world, right? So I'll mention climate change and stuff in a little bit. So, but for education to live up to the goal that we want it to have, requires, in fact, the village that Carrie mentioned, right? It requires committed teachers, effective teaching strategies, motivated learners, supportive families, well-resourced schools. And of course, all of these factors are dependent on policymakers, right? So we need, in fact, teachers to have behavioral, social, and emotional well-being themselves. We need families to be able to support their kids. We need commitments from school districts, communities, the state, and federal policymakers. All of this is in fact at the foundation, right? So we've got to have a foundation on which we build. So the situation pre-pandemic, right? I study, among other things, the achievement gap. And I know there are lots of people who call it the opportunity gap, and I have no problem with that phrase. But I would say that, in fact, the opportunity gap results in an achievement gap, which then results in a further opportunity gap. It's not one or the other, it's both. And that gap is real. It results in adult poverty, it results in income inequality, and then the cycle continues through the generations. So if we look at reading scores by ethnicity from 1992 to 2007, I'm not sure if you can see that, but you can see Black and Hispanic scores are below white, and Asian scores, American Indian scores are also down. And to show this graph in another light, again, here we see those scores. Now, these scores are not problematic just because there are differences, there are different levels, right? The person gets an A versus a B, it's a different level, but they've both passed the course. These scores are problematic because they reflect a lack of proficiency. And that lack of proficiency then is what affects students moving forward, right? So when we look at the percent below proficient, 80% of African American, American Indian kids are below, almost 80% of Hispanic kids are below proficient. That is outrageous. It's outrageous in a country where we have no problem saying we are the richest country in the world, we have the largest GDP, and so forth, right? And when we look at the people who are at the advanced level, again, it's the reverse. Very, very few students across groups, right? Now, remember, this is through 2017. This is pre-pandemic, right? That translates, of course, into lower college enrollment and graduation rates. We know that socioeconomic status plays a role. So 80% of high-income students enroll in college. 70% of those students graduate, right? When we look at 50% of low-income students enrolling in schools, and then the graduation rate for low-income students is tremendously low. Now, I'm not here to argue for charter schools, but I use the KIPP Charter Schools Knowledge and Spark program as an example that if you do get some things right, you can change things, right? And so I'm not arguing for KIPP here, but they have similar percentages of students in their schools, mostly low income, enrolling in college. But as you can see, their graduation rates, while not as high as the high income graduation rates, are higher than. That means, in fact, there are things that we can do that if all of us do these things, many more of our kids will be better served. So, and then we move on from college and we get to median incomes in the United States. And as you can see, we see the pattern that we'd expect to see. Asian Americans and European Americans who are ones who are going to college in greater rates and stuff are having higher median incomes than their counterparts, and the reverse for living in poverty, right? And this translated in living in poverty, when we look at the children living in poverty, we are seeing that there are substantial numbers of African American kids, American Indian kids, Hispanic American kids who are living in poverty. Now, all of this speaks to our nation's policy decisions. And I know that there are people, many people who in Congress are who want to do the right thing. But I would argue that many of them are out of touch with the general population. This is from a colleague of mine, Jonathan Way, who studies elite environments. And when we look at 40%, 41% of our federal judges have gone to an elite school, 45% of billionaires, so Fortune 500 CEOs. Many of these individuals do not understand, I think, are not in touch with what's going on with the general public. And so therefore they're much less likely to pass policies that in fact have meaningful impacts on the general public. Now, and let me make it clear, I love America. I'm an American citizen. I'm a naturalized American citizen, I think is the term. I chose America as a country. So, I mean, I have opportunities here that I did not have in Trinidad and Tobago, where I'm from. And, if I had not come to the United States, I wouldn't be standing here. But when we look at the wealth, on the left is the top 10 wealthiest nations in the world. See the United States is at number 8. And then on the right is the countries with the largest wealth gaps. And there's one country that's in both lists, right? And so America, we are in some sense one can say we are getting some things right. We are making a lot of wealth, but we are getting some things wrong because that wealth gap translates into less education for those at the bottom, right? In 2019, the wealthiest 10% of American households controlled 75% of household net worth. That's the nature of income inequality in this country. But I don't want to beat up on America because I think we oftentimes tend to be a little myopic in the United States. The achievement gap is not limited to the United States. it is an international problem. We certainly have it in Trinidad and Tobago, although it's not black-white there. Tends to be more black East Indian and by income. And this is a study on the achievement gap in Australia and New Zealand. And New Zealand is an interesting country to look at in some ways because it's much smaller than the US, but it parallels the US in many ways, in that we have New Zealanders who are white, so Pākehā as they're called. Then you have, of course, Asians who are coming in, so they're Asian New Zealanders. Then they have the native New Zealanders, the Maori, and then they also have the Pacifica, which are the immigrants from Tonga, Fiji, Samoa, and those. Much like we have a large Hispanic population. So when we look at university enrollment rates in the US, we see the pattern: Asian Americans, European Americans, multi-ethnic, and so forth. We see the same pattern in New Zealand, exact same pattern, and here's them on the same graph. So at the very, the ones who are enrolling the most in New Zealand, Asians and Asian Americans at the top, Europeans next, Hispanic and African Americans, and then, but we have the Maori, the Pacifica, so we see the pattern is not unique to the United States. And what that says to me, right, is that we can learn from others, so that in point of fact, we don't only have to look for solutions here in the United States, we can look for solutions in other places. New Zealand, again, it's smaller, and they're trying, I think, they're trying in ways that we probably are not willing to try yet. I was down there a number of years ago, and it was the Rugby World Cup was going on. New Zealand was playing, I believe it was France or South Africa. I can't remember who the opponent was. And rugby is their big game. And so their team is called the All Blacks, and they were playing against, and the national anthem was playing, and I was listening to it, and the language, the major language of New Zealand is English. It was a former British colony. And then the second verse of the anthem started, and I wasn't understanding what was being said anymore. And then I said, oh, I wonder. And they sing the second verse in Maori, which is their native language, right? Their native people language. And what occurred to me at the time was at least some people get so upset when in fact people talk about perhaps singing the American national anthem in Navajo or in Spanish as if somehow it's a corruption of the thing, but it's really a way of signaling that you are one of us, that we are all together, we belong to each other, right? Now, I've talked about education, but the other thing that was going on pre-COVID, we also were having mental health issues, right? And so these data on suicidal thoughts and behaviors for high school youth in 2019, and as you can see, there are, again, any suicide is too much, but as you can see, we have substantial percentages with American Indians and Alaskan Natives having the highest suicidal thoughts and behaviors in the US. And so this is a substantial problem. One of the things to note about this is because we often focus on the underrepresented groups. But as you can see here, that white students are having suicide rates at comparable rates to blacks and Hispanics. And so, again, this idea that, in fact, there are many of our youth who are not being served, right? Some more than others, but there are many, many problems across the board. And then we have suicidal thoughts in adults. And these are 2020 data, but based on 2019. And so this is a situation we have sort of pre-pandemic. So this is where we were, right? And one of my students has come up with a wonderful metaphor, I think, to explain, I think, a way to understand this. David Stevens, he is actually a doctoral student in social research methodologies. He uses the metaphor of tailwinds and headwinds. Now, I spend a lot of time in the air, as you can imagine. As I've told you, I've traveled every week since the last week in August. I think the first trip was in the Netherlands, then I went to Israel from there, then I went on to Morocco, went to Atlanta and stuff, I can't remember where next, but like I was in DC last week, and the week before that, I was in, I think, the Dominican Republic was, but you get the idea. Coming from California to New York, or California to DC, which is where I go most of the time, is a shorter flight than going from DC back to California. Because the prevailing winds for the United States are the westerlies. They're blowing west to east. And so lots of tailwinds coming, more headwinds going back. And this metaphor, I think, is a great metaphor for us to understand what's going on in our system, right? Because the people with the tailwinds, it's like they're starting a little bit ahead of others, right? Right? So, in fact, one time we were flying back from Miami to San Francisco, and the headwinds were so strong, we had to land in Houston to get extra fuel because the headwinds were so strong, right? And so that's, in fact, what some of our students are facing. They're facing substantial headwinds, whereas there are other students who, in fact, have tremendous tailwinds. And we have some idea of what those tailwinds and headwinds can be, right? Tailwinds, high parent educational level, stable housing, a high history of academic success, and so forth, whereas the headwinds, having a disability, being an English learner, homelessness, history of academic struggles, and so forth. And of course, all of these things interact, right? So that there are some people, intersectionality has become a big term in education and psychology circles in the last few years, because one can be homeless and Black and have a disability and so forth. And so therefore you have compounded headwinds, right? So with that, let's look at the impact of the pandemic. As many of you probably have heard, test scores went down, right? Right, so this made the news. Peggy, I can't remember her last name, but the commissioner of NCES, she and I were on a committee of the American Educational Research Association together a couple of years ago. We have this drop in scores. But this drop in scores, this is the overall drop, but when we look at things, we see a kind of a Matthew effect. The Matthew effect is the rich get richer, right? And so that one of the best examples of the Matthew effect was Sesame Street, the impact of Sesame Street. Sesame Street was introduced to give children from low-income families a head start, right? And so, it's, Big Bird and all of them, and Cookie Monster and the A is for Apple and all of that sort of thing. And what happened, it had its biggest impact on middle and upper middle class children, because the parents of those families recognized what the show was trying to do, and they made their kids watch it, right? And so it had a bigger impact. So even though it was designed to improve, right, the education preparedness of kids from low-income families, it actually had a bigger impact on kids from middle and upper middle families. So I say a type of Matthew effect because this learning loss has not been equal, right? There's been greater learning loss lower down the ladder. So children at the upper end, at the 90th percentile, lost 2 percentage points in reading, whereas those at the 10th percentile, so they're down at the bottom, they lost 10 points in reading, right? And again, as I said, the goal of public education, is to help those who need the help the most, right? And these are the ones, in fact, who have been most impacted. And we can see the same pattern in mathematics and across the board. We can see it by suburban versus city and so forth. We can see it in a variety of ways. I have a number of these charts. And then when we get to how kids think about themselves, right? So 70% of students recalled experiencing remote learning loss. What supports did these students have? And so look at the 58% of the students of the 20% didn't think had a desktop computer, whereas it's 83%, right? So that technology divide, but it's not just technology, right? High-speed internet, a quiet place to work at home, had their teacher available to help them with schoolwork every day or almost every day, 26% versus 45%. As you can see, this pattern, right, is replicating itself in many ways, and it leads to, in fact, a belief in your abilities to succeed. So this last slide speaks to the confidence, right? The proportion of students who, in fact, are confident that they can get recognized, that they don't learn something, the probability that they can ask for help, the probability that they can find learning resources. And again, you can see that those from wealthy families, the majority of them can, whereas those from other families, the majority of them cannot. So that's the learning part for COVID. And then anxiety and depression. Now, anxiety and depression were going up before COVID hit in youth. Those of us who study these things had seen those data in 2019. As you can see, but they went up tremendously during COVID, right? Almost doubling doubling in terms of depression and so forth, right? So that's youth. And then one of the things I study is time. I study time perspective, right? All of us here experienced what it was living in the shutdown. And some of you probably have the sense the time got distorted, not just the daytime, right? So that normally brush your teeth, get ready, go to work, right? And stuff, come back home in the afternoon and so forth. That's not happening. For kids, they're not going to school. They're sitting down at the table, right? Maybe the one table in the house. In fact, in recommendations to parents, we suggested, get a little sign or a little, make a little thing, schoolhouse, so this is, and so that when you break for lunch, you take away that. So you're trying to signal, right, that these daily events, that your arc of the day is happening. But more than that, the arc of the week, the arc of the month, right? And so, there's been a confirmation that the pandemic led many people worldwide to experience distortions in their perceptions of time. And 2 recent surveys have said that, in fact, roughly 2/3 of people, and these are sizable surveys, reported feeling out of sync. Now, I'm a morning person. I typically got up before COVID at 3:45 a.m., went to the gym for 5 o'clock, got to the office by 6:30, and I know people are laughing, yes. I'm a morning person, my brother is. My brother's wife says she's not a warrior. She's married into the family, and she doesn't do that. But during COVID, I was getting up at 7, and I couldn't go to the gym, and stuff. My whole day turned upside down, and I'd end the day and saying, I didn't get anything done. Where did this day go? Because my day had changed. But more importantly is that individuals who had greater feelings of time distortion, there's data suggesting they may be at higher risk for developing mental health problems. So, right. I think, it's probably not unfair to say that the pandemic was the most profound international event that we've had in perhaps since the Black Plague or something like this, and maybe even beyond that. But on top of the pandemic, we have the effects of climate change, which were going on before. Hurricanes have continued, fires have continued, floods have continued. I mean, as if you followed the news, you know that in fact, there are parts of Pakistan which were dry land that are now lakes, right? And stuff, California, fires we have ongoing things. Ongoing mass shootings in schools. Increasing concerns about civil rights, right? The murder of George Floyd and others. Increased political polarization, attack on voting rights, LGBTQ rights, book bans at an all-time high. I mean, things like, Huckleberry Finn. A lot of books that were considered classics. There are many school districts where they can now not be used. And inflation, right? I drive a Nissan Altima. I've had a Nissan, I think, for the longest while. I'm a bit of a Nissan fan, right? My first car of my own was a Nissan in Trinidad. And it used to cost me $60 to fill up the tank. It now costs me $92 to fill up the tank. Now, I can afford it, right? But that's a substantial increase, right? A more than 50% increase in the car, right? Price of gas. The other thing is, I don't have to go into the office as much as I used to anyway, because many of the staff are not coming in every day. I'm not teaching this year. I'm traveling a lot. So I am not affected, even though, again, a Matthew effect. Yeah. The cost, I'm not affected. Many people are affected a lot more. And one of the things that does is this is not just affecting adults. It's affecting kids in homes, right? In the 1980s into the early 1990s, one of the greatest fears of American adolescents was a fear of nuclear war. And that went away. The war in Ukraine has brought that back onto the table. kids are asking their parents, are we going to have a nuclear war? Nobody knows what Putin is going to do. He has threatened nuclear war on occasion. And the other thing that we have going on right now is we have media, 24-hour media, in a way that you didn't have 25 years ago and so forth. So it's not, you can't even sort of protect your kids from it. Many kids have cell phones, which actually have media feeds, and those kinds of things. So this is really, really hard. APA does a stress in America poll, and we collected the most recent one, the data collected between August 18 and September 2nd of this year, right? Interviews in English and Spanish, weighted and so forth, right? 64% of adults felt that their rights are under attack. And as you can see, these numbers differ: 66% of black adults, 67% of white adults, 67% of women, 68% of people with disabilities, 72% of LGBTQ plus, IA plus individuals, right? Substantial portions of our society are feeling under attack. The racial climate is a significant source of stress. Again, black adults at the top of this list at 75%, but look at the other groups. 70% of Hispanics, 69% of Asians, and a majority of whites, right? That these things are affecting all of us in a multiplicity of ways. Inflation is a significant source of stress for many, many individuals. And, and this was a surprise to me because I would have thought it would have been African Americans, but Latinas are most likely to cite violence and crime, mass shootings, as a significant source of stress in their lives. But the numbers are high across the board. This, I think, is important. We have 27% of adults saying that stress is so high that they cannot function, right? Now, these are adults, and these are adults who are parents, right? And so they're not functioning. How are their kids doing? I'm a member of the APA Task Force on Violence Against Educators and School Personnel, and in fact, so I wanted to highlight this. This is a college of education and so forth, right? And so we actually were just about to launch a survey when COVID hit. We have a number of partner organizations, social workers, National Education Association, and so forth, social work, school psychologists. And we ended up having to delay a bit. And then when we did release the survey, we asked questions of pre-COVID and during COVID, because COVID, so we actually delayed a couple months. And levels of victimization: 54% of participants reported experiencing violence. That's across teachers, school psychologists, and social workers, general staff, and administrators. And this is what I want to share with you again, this idea of stress. That people are finding their work stressful, as you can see, pre-COVID levels, and during COVID, stress accelerated for all groups. We actually just collected Wave 2 data. We met with our partners in DC on Friday, I believe it was, and we were sharing with them the preliminary Wave 2 data. It's interesting, right, because the stress has continued to go up for some groups and not for others. And what has happened is that the victimization, a lot of the violence went down during COVID when schools were in shutdown. And now that they're back in schools, they're higher than they were pre-COVID levels, because many people are, in fact, extremely stressed. And so much of the support that would be provided to youth by adults is not available, right? So to move on, let me see what's, okay, going on time. So current responses. The government is throwing a lot of money at mental health services in the community, including school districts. And this is a good thing on the one hand. Psychology has never been sought after so much as it is now. People are recognizing the importance of psychology for their personal lives. They're recognizing the importance of psychology and mental health in schools, in the workplace, right? So psychology has become a hot topic. But for instance, and so, with the money from COVID and some of the post-COVID bills, schools, some, at least in California, some of the school districts are getting so much money, they don't know how to spend it. There are fewer people, teachers have quit, right? And they have money, and so they're starting 3, 4, 5 programs that are not coordinated. So that they're having a lot of programs, it's not clear that the students are benefiting from all of these programs that they're having. Because you need to plan, to be able to do this. The other thing that has happened, and of course in response to George Floyd and so forth, is the term anti-racism has taken on enormous significance. So you can't do any program now if it's not anti-racist, right? Non-racist is no longer enough, right? And this is my fear. I study, among other things, racial and ethnic identity. I'm afraid that people are going to say, oh, we've done all these anti-racist programs, something like a George Floyd happens, and people are going to be tremendously disappointed and tremendously stressed because they're going to assume that just because I've put certain programs in place, these things will never happen again, right? But we know that attitudes of this kind take time to change. Not that we shouldn't do the programs, but expectations, right? And of course, we are seeing a backlash in the political arena for anti-racism and this notion of blaming schools for teaching critical race theory, which many schools have not heard of because it's typically taught in law schools and graduate schools of education, right? And stuff, but it's become convenient for some politicians to call it out. So, what can we do? So I'd like to think, the first thing is I really think that we need to start taking a public health approach to societal problems, and education is a key component. One of the things that we know, right, and when I remember that slide of the headwinds and the tailwinds, what was one of the strong tailwinds? Education. Education level of parents, but also the education of students, right? Education is a fundamental public health issue in this country. Individuals who are more educated are less likely to get serious illness, in large part sometimes because they also have health insurance. But so there's prevention, and then they take better care of themselves. So education, right? But we need to be thinking societally. So we need to be thinking universal Head Start, for instance, universal preschool. That's an important thing, right? So not just preschool for the people who can afford it, right? We need to recognize that there are social determinants of health and mental health, and these require societal solutions. I mentioned education, but income and income distribution, right? So I showed you the wealth gap that this country has. Stockton, California is doing a 5-year experiment where they're doing a basic minimum wage to see if people, in fact, if there's a living wage, if that will, in fact, change trajectories, not just for families, but for the kids themselves. My first visit to New Zealand, when I got down there and we went out to dinner and, said, no, you don't have to add a tip to you don't have to add a tip for the waiter or anything like that, because we pay a living wage. Everybody gets paid a living wage. They're not very happy with Americans right away now, because now that Americans have been going down there in droves since Lord of the Rings, movies came out, the tip jars have started coming out because Americans are going and tipping anyway. Because if you can afford to fly to New Zealand, you typically can afford to tip. And so forth, just so you know, but unemployment and job security, I mean, that's a major, of course, issue related to income. But just the working conditions, right? Are you treated with respect at your place of work, and stuff. And early childhood development, I talked about universal preschool. Food insecurity, I mean, I would not have thought that in 2022, UC Berkeley we have food pantries for our doctoral students. In fact, not just the doctoral students, the undergrads and so forth. We have periodic food banks and those kinds of things because students can't afford. The Bay Area, as some of you may know, is the most expensive area to live in the country. So I tell people I live San Francisco adjacent because I couldn't afford to live in San Francisco. And the median house price in San Francisco is something like 8 million, some ridiculous amount of money. Social exclusion, social safety nets, that's that income inequality thing. Health services. Universal, I mean, again, this is a controversial thing, and this is not for the record, I'm an independent. But we are one, of the few major countries. Canada next door has it, the UK has it. We do not have universal healthcare. And there are many individuals. We spend a lot of money on healthcare that we should not have to spend because people don't get things taken care of when they are small problems until they become big problems, right? And that has implications for families because people are off work. there have been tons of stories over the last couple years now in NPR and other places about somebody who went in for something minor and then ends up with a $10,000 bill that they cannot pay, right? All of that is ridiculous. And then, of course, we know the issues about gender, race, ethnicity, ability, status, and so forth. So when we look at educational attainment, right, it results in health knowledge, health literacy, and behaviors, nutrition, exercise, and so forth. I told you I went to the gym at 5, not because I like it. I am a couch potato at heart. Believe you me. But I recognize the importance of the gym, right? And so that's why I do it, because I want to live longer, give myself a little bit of an extra edge, right? In terms of work, it relates to your working conditions. It relates to the kinds of resources you have, of course, your income. That has implications for health. And it also has implications for your sense of control, right? That happened as a result of the pandemic, where many people were able to say to their employer who they didn't like, because there were lots of jobs available, take this job and shove it. Remember that song? Right? Because I have options, right? But you see, even in a time when the jobs are not as plentiful, education gives you this sense of control. It's an important aspect of what we do. It results in social standing and often in social support. So all of these things contribute to health. And so this population health approach is one that really needs to become how we do things in the United States, right? One of the things that's happening in tomorrow's election is that in some states, they're deciding whether to expand Medicare and stuff, to expand health care to all people. This should not be something that we are debating, at least to my mind. And I come from a developing country. I'll tell you, my father passed away from cancer. I went back to Trinidad on one occasion. Now, Trinidad has universal health care, but it has free health care is what it has. I mean, universal, not quite. And so my father was going in for chemotherapy to the hospital every month or something like this. And so I arrive in Trinidad, I'm there, and he says to me, my aunt was a little older as well. He says, you can take me. I have to go in next week to get my treatment and stuff, and so you can take me. Auntie Lynn doesn't have to take me. I said, of course. So the day before, I said to him, what time is your appointment? No. He said to me, we've got to leave home at 5 o'clock a.m. I said, 5? What time is your appointment? Oh, they don't do appointments. It's a first come, first serve basis.
Yeah.
So we left home at 5 o'clock. We got to the hospital at 5:20. We're not that far away from it. There were a couple people there ahead of us. There was this guy who had come from southern Trinidad. We live in the north. He had been in a cab for an hour and a half. These are people who are dying and stuff. And at 9 o'clock, a little after 9, a doctor came up with a yellow pad and said, okay, who is here first? Right? That is not what this should be about. Right? That's the reason I'm in the United States and not in Trinidad and Tobago, right? In part, right? Because we as a country know better and should be able to do better, not just for those of us who have university degrees, but for everybody in our society, right? We need to provide effective and efficient clinical care for those with issues. We need to mitigate risk and early intervention and to provide early intervention for people who are at risk. And we need to spend a lot more on keeping people healthy than we do now. Invest in prevention. It's the best thing. We need to recognize that solutions that are easy are probably not going to work. I think it's, again, I will not name names, but, some politicians tell you, elect me, I'll solve the problem, I'm going to do X, right? This election, a lot of people saying, oh, inflation, just put us in office and I'll end inflation. Now, I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to pretend to be one. And it may well be that there are some policies that people can pass that will have some impact on inflation. But if you cannot stop climate change, if you cannot stop the war in Ukraine, if you cannot sort of fix the supply chain stuff that COVID still happens, China's in shutdown again. Those of you who want iPhones for Christmas, you've heard they're going up. because the factory, there's a COVID shutdown in the place where the iPhone factory is. If you can't do those things, you're not going to stop inflation. So simple solutions, right, are not the answer, right? And we need to plan in the short, medium, and longer term. We tend to think of short-term solutions. When, we put a program in place in a school, and next year we go back and say, well, nothing has changed. We're ending the program. Schools, learning takes time. Change takes time. And we think in short term, we think in political elections. We think in election cycles rather than in terms of real intervention cycles. And that does not help us. We need to prioritize interventions and constructs with a preponderance of evidence. So let me jump into here, right? So access to research is now at a great height. Everybody tweets their new finding. They get interviewed on NPR, CNN, Fox, you name it, right? But many times these research findings are written for the public. They inform public policy, but they're not the heart of the findings. And so I'm going to, I'll talk about psychosocial constructs. Let me look at the time here. Okay, so psychosocial constructs are constructs that affect behavior and cognitions, and that are in turn affected by this social context, right? And, that's one definition. Dixon et al. Says motivational constructs that are affected by both psychological and social context. So lots of people, you may have heard of non-cognitive skills. People call them non-cognitive. I don't like the term non-cognitive because they involve some cognition. And so I prefer to use psychosocial. So there are a lot of these skills out there right now. And certainly I know there are two you've heard of, grit and growth mindset, because they're all over schooling, right? But I'll tell you, so cautionary tales. In 2007, in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Angela Duckworth introduced the grit scale. Grit, perseverance, and passion for accomplishing long-term goals. Now that is something that we know is really important. Can you persevere, right? Can you to pursue your goals? In that study, and JPSP is one of our top journals, she reported that grit accounts for 4% of the variance in outcomes on average. 4%. It's not 0, it's not 10, it's not 20, it's not 35, 4. Which is fine, right? And she talked about, statistical significance, but didn't talk about practical significance. And she concluded, as rightly so, that future researchers needed to see how it works. But then she was on the radio. And she says a person's grit score is highly predictive of achievement under challenging circumstances. It was the best predictive success for a West Point cadet. Now, I would not succeed at West Point. As I said, I'm a couch potato, right? But grit mattered more than intelligence, leadership ability, or physical fitness. If you want to win the national spelling bee, grit is what you need, right? Then she wrote a popular press book, and she repeated those claims. How to succeed in West Point is grit. It's a critical factor in Chicago public schools if you want an MBA, PhD, MD, right? Now, can you remember how much percent it accounted for? 4. That's all I will say, right? So Dixon, and this is one of my former students, so that's why I'm citing him a lot. He looked at grit predicting ability, and it accounted for less than 1% in this particular study. In this study, less than 1%. This is a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is when we look at an entire set of studies and combine the combined effect. And in column, let me see, what column? The KNP observed row. In the row column, which is just before the SD column, you see 0.18, 0.18, 0.17, 0.17. Those are correlations. A moderate effect size should be 0.2. 0.2 tells you have something meaningful, right? Those are getting near there, but they're not quite. And so on the base of this meta-analysis, he concluded that our results suggest interventions designed to enhance grit may only have weak effects on performance and success. The construct validity of grit is in question. The primary utility of grit may lie in the perseverance facet. Well, perseverance is something we know about. We didn't need grit to tell us that, right? But talk about millions of dollars. Carrie and all of us who are researchers who apply for dollars. Lots of dollars didn't come our way because they went to grit schools, right? Millions of dollars. Similarly with growth mindset, I'm not going to go through this in detail. They did a set of studies, a meta-analysis, and you can see the meta-analytic correlation in one study was minus 0.10. It wasn't positive. That means, in fact, kids did worse, not slightly worse, right? In a second study, right, it was 0.08, right? Now, I think grit is not a bad idea. I think growth mindset is not a bad idea. I think we need to avoid simple and simplistic solutions. Education requires multifaceted things. We need teachers to recognize that, right? So, interventions with demonstrated and meaningful positive effects on education are things we know about already. Formative evaluation, right? So we keep looking for the new thing, for the fad. Let's go back to the thing that we actually know works. Formative evaluation, effect size above 0.8. Micro-teaching, that's when you're taking mini lessons, teaching kids in small groups, right? Teacher clarity. Does the teacher understand what they're teaching and can explain it well? The relationship, is the relationship with the teacher and the student positive? The biggest impact teachers have on students is relational. Somebody who was in high school with me, lived on my block, my mother was always telling me, why can't you be more like him? Because he was getting A's all the time, and I have a couple of F's on my transcript. In Form 5, ordinary level exams, he got, A, B, and C was passed. He got an A in everything except history. He hated the history teacher. And he deliberately failed history despite the history teacher, right? Teacher-student relationships matter, right? Teaching metacognition, teaching vocabulary, right? Reading, you've probably heard, we learn to read up to grade 4, from grade 4 on, you're reading to learn. If you cannot read, if you don't have vocabulary, you're not. Repeated reading, creativity, phonics, right? There is the reading wars are still going on in universities when we know what works. But academics, we are guilty. We love to hold on to our theories, even when we can't prove them. Right. Teaching comprehension, right? Acceleration. Now, I know gifted and talented has become a bad thing, but there are some students for whom the curriculum is just too slow. They can move faster. And the thing that shows the biggest effects for those kids is moving them along. I did not know, when I was in secondary school in Trinidad, you could skip from Form 2 to Form 4. They skipped one class from Form 2 to Form 4. I did not get the skip, by the way. I went to Form 3. But I didn't know what it was, but it was acceleration. Now that I study this, I understand. That's what they were doing. Classroom management. Teachers need to know how to manage the class. If you're spending a lot of your time dealing with behavior, you're not teaching. So being able to control student behavior, the classroom climate, small group learning. And at the individual student level, again, we like to beat up on intelligence, but it's an important thing. But it can be developed, right? Intelligence actually and education are actually bidirectional, have a bidirectional relationship. Prior achievement, persistence, engagement, so we know about that. Perseverance, that's what it is, right? And grit does not measure it. At least the grit scale is measured by Duckworth. Motivation, and of course, preschool, right? And what school personnel said they want. This is from our study of the teachers who were reporting violence, right? They are reporting, can I read the small print here? I think I'm going to need to read it here. Social and emotional learning approaches. I have bifocal contacts, but they're not quite working. Trauma-informed practices. Working with, so somebody read them for me? Restorative justice, thank you.
Working with diverse groups.
Learning how to work with diverse groups.
And de-escalation strategies.
And de-escalation strategies, which is related in some sense to classroom management, right? So, I'm actually going to tell one more cautionary tale and then I'm going to stop. I'm not going to go into my research. I think as you get older, you talk longer, but so I normally would have finished before. I'll tell one more cautionary tale. And this has to do with those of us who are researchers, and then I'll skip all the way through to my end slides. Metacognition is something that we know is really important. It's on the slide here, right? And metacognition refers to people's knowledge and regulation of their thinking and learning processes, right? It's like, it's the feedback, right? It's looking at feedback, not just from others, but yourself, right? And there are 35 years of research demonstrating the importance of metacognition on achievement. But in 2002, a colleague at Penn State developed a metacognition scale, and she looked at the correlation between that metacognition scale and reading performance and problem solving. You can see negative 0.08, negative, and 0 for reading, right? Whoa. So on the basis of that one study, we have 35 years of research and people saying, oh, we shouldn't teach metacognition anymore. That's a problem. We need to pay attention to the preponderance of evidence. So one of my doctoral students for her dissertation looked at that, and what we can see, I'll go to the results slide here. Is this the one I want to show? No. No, we found the same thing. The scale was not measuring related to mathematics achievement and GPA and so forth. But we actually then interviewed students and coded them, were they using metacognition or not? And what we discovered is while metacognition did not distinguish, right, those who are low and high metacognition, if you look at their math grade, you see minus 0.05 at the bottom, top of the bottom group there. So that's their math grade, that's their math GPA. The general GPA, it's 0.26. For this particular effect size, you need it to be 0.4. So again, it suggests that metacognition doesn't matter. But what that says is that the school is not challenging these kids enough. This was a gifted and talented sample. Because when we look at their diagnostic score to get into the gifted and talented program, you can see a tremendous difference between those who are low in metacognition and those who are high, with an effect size of 0.53. You can see that, in fact, the grade that they got in the summer program, 0.53, and you can see that their accuracy in solving problems, an effect size of 2.1 is huge, right? So it matters, right? Now, I study a set of psychosocial constructs, so I'm going to go through all of them. I'm going to skip all of that. Basically, what it is that time matters and racial identity and stuff matter. And I will end with my, because I want to give some time to questions, right? So, predicting personality and all of these things. And by the way, we are not using schools yet. We're just testing. We're saying these can be used in schools. They're predicting a lot better than grit, a lot better than growth mindset. And they're predicting longitudinally and so forth. There we are, concluding thoughts. No silver bullets or magic wands. Researchers need to work with students, teachers, and principals, not at them. Constructs need to be tested and assessed before being recommended for general use. Governments need to spend education dollars more wisely. You know, we need to worry about Matthew effects, right? We need to worry less about reducing the achievement gap than raising the achievement floor. This is an important point. The reason the achievement gap is a problem is because the people at the lower end of the gap are not proficient. If all of them were proficient and then could do whatever they wanted to do, the gap would be less important, right? So that's the thing. So what we need to ask, what can we change and what can we make strong claims about? We need to avoid deficit perspectives. Everybody talks about that. That we need to avoid deficit perspectives, not focusing on negative stereotypes and so forth. That's true, and I support it. And we also need to do the same thing about our society. We need to not adopt deficit perspectives about our systems. What in fact works, we need to identify what works and what does not and change what does not. And I'm going to end. I was an English teacher. I'm still an English teacher at heart, even though I ended up studying psychology. But there are two poets who I like to quote. One is Langston Hughes, African from the Harlem Renaissance. Let America be America again. America never was America to me. I am the poor white, fooled and pushed apart. I am the Negro bearing slavery's scars. I am the red man driven from the land. I am the immigrant clutching the hope I seek and finding only the same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak. That is not what we want our schools to be. What we want our schools to be is the road not taken. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Our task is to enable every kid in front of us to take the road less traveled. It's involved, and not just every kid, but every staff member, every teacher, everybody in our schools, in fact, everybody in our society, to be able to take that road less traveled. Langston Hughes was a black male in America. He could not take the road less traveled at the time he was writing that, right? Frost could. He was a white male. We need to change that so that, in fact, it applies to everybody. Thanks for your attention. I think I have 5 minutes for questions.